I've seen it happen a lot. Someone spots a cheap keyboard online, thinks they've snagged a deal, and then a week later they're wrestling with limited patches, no aftertouch, and a feel that makes every chord feel flat. That regret can turn a hobby into a headache, especially when the instrument sits in a home studio and you're trying to capture something real. The question I keep hearing is there a mid-range synth that actually earns the price tag and doesn't leave me wishing I'd spend a bit more? Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The Kurzweil K2088 lands right in that sweet spot where a serious player wants depth without the boutique price tag, but the casual buyer still worries about overpaying for features they'll never use. If you've spent time scrolling through endless synth forums, you know the market is split between two camps. The budget-friendly workhorses that get you basic sounds, and the high-end rigs that boast every modulation matrix imaginable. The K2088 tries to bridge that gap with its 88-key weighted hammer action, aftertouch, and the V.A.S.T engine that underpins a massive library of factory programs. That's a lot to unpack, so let's break down what that actually means when you sit down at the keyboard for a regular jam session, a studio recording, or even a quick lesson with a student. First, the feel. The weighted keys are modeled after a piano action, which is a big win if you already play acoustic piano or want a realistic transition to synth work. I've tested the K2088 in a small bedroom studio, and the hammer action feels solid enough that my fingers don't flop around, yet it isn't so heavy that I'm exhausted after a 30-minute rehearsal. The addition of aftertouch on each key gives you that expressive punch press harder, and the sound can open up, swell, or modulate depending on how you program it. For a composer writing cinematic scores, that nuance can be the difference between a flat pad and a breathing, evolving texture. Now on to the sounds. Kurzweil packs over 2,000 factory programs and more than 500 multi-combinations, which sounds like a staggering number until you realize most of those patches are organized into logical groups. Classic analog leads, FM-type bells, vintage piano emulations, and the K2 series synth-based tones that many longtime Kurzweil fans love. In practice, I found the virtual analog VA1 engine to be surprisingly versatile. When I needed a gritty bass for an electronic track, dialing in the VA1 gave me a warm, punchy tone that sat nicely in the mix without the thinness you sometimes get from cheaper analog modeling synths. The 6-operator FM engine, on the other hand, delivered those metallic, bell-like textures that are hard to recreate on a purely sample-based instrument. I used it for a film scoring mock-up where I wanted a subtle, evolving shimmer in the background, and the FM patches provided exactly that. One practical strength that often gets lost in spec sheets is how the K2088 handles polyphony. With 256 voices, you can layer several sounds, split the keyboard, and still have enough heads to sustain chords and arpeggios without voice stealing. In a live setting, that meant I could split the left hand for a classic organ patch while the right hand played a lead synth, and the transitions were seamless. The multi-combination memory makes recalling those splits a one-button operation, which saves a lot of time when you're moving between gigs. However, the K2088 isn't without trade-offs. The interface, while functional, leans on menus that can feel a bit dated compared to newer touchscreen synths. If you're used to scrolling through a graphical waveform view, you'll find yourself pressing a few more buttons to reach deeper parameters. That learning curve isn't a deal-breaker, but it does mean you'll spend a few minutes in the manual before you can tweak the modulation envelope the way you'd like. Another practical consideration is the size and weight. At full 88 key size, it's a solid piece of gear that needs a dedicated stand or a sturdy desk. For a bedroom musician with limited space, that could be a limiting factor. Who should buy the K2088? If you are a pianist who wants a realistic feel and the ability to dive into synth territory without swapping instruments, this is a strong candidate. It's also a good fit for composers and producers who need a wide palette of sounds, especially those who value the classic Kurzweil timbres that have been used on countless pop and film productions. The aftertouch and extensive polyphony make it suitable for live performers who need expressive control on stage. On the other hand, if you're a hobbyist who only needs a few basic synth patches for occasional practice, the price and size may be more than you need. Likewise, if you're chasing the absolute latest UI trends and want a touchscreen workflow, you might feel cramped by the button-heavy layout. In real-world use, the K2088 shines when you let its depth play out. I set up a small teaching studio and used the instrument for a lesson on sound design. The student,